All right, America, let's think about the Supreme Court. We have a good previous video about why term limits are so important for members of Congress, why the only thing Congress has never done is the one thing that we pretty much all agree that it should do, which is set term limits on itself. But it's never done that. But today, let's talk about why Congress might want to consider, why we the people might want to consider putting term limits on Supreme Court justices. So as you can see, there's nothing in the Constitution about the length of service for Supreme Court justices. The Article 3 of the Constitution setting up the Supreme Court is the shortest of the three articles talking about the three branches of government. It doesn't specifically say lifetime appointment, but it's kind of inherent in there because it doesn't talk about re-election or term limits or anything for Supreme Court. So it's kind of written in there that it's assumed that there'll be a lifetime appointment for the Supreme Court, assuming good behavior, and that's what's impeachable. If you look this up, there are some really good concerns about why you might not want to make justices have terms, whether it's 4-year term, 8-year, 10-year term, 12-year term, maybe a 15-plus year term, as opposed to a life term in the Supreme Court for good behavior. There are some pros and cons. There are some questions about what's best for the United States of America, for our citizens. However, term limits for Supreme Court justices are incredibly well supported. 58 to 67% of Republicans and Democrats, respectively, in this poll number of years ago, supported term limits for justices. Now, there is some data that maybe Republicans have more to lose if the justices have term limits, because Republicans have put in more justices than Democrats over time. If Republicans think that's a reason not to support term limits for the Supreme Court, it's a big risk politically, because in the future, it could be more Democrats putting justices in, right? Politicization of the Supreme Court goes back and forth. And that's really the main reason why we, after 250 years, would want to consider term limits for Supreme Court justices, because this is not some liberal ploy to have more liberal control over the Supreme Court or keep the court from being too conservative. It's about the politicization of the Supreme Court. This is really about how political the Supreme Court has become. How we're all so worried about, is this justice going to be more left-leaning or more right-leaning? Which president appointed this justice? Who do they really align with? And all this really is not even to mention the concerns we have about how political the Supreme Court has become. There are two Last Week Tonight with John Oliver videos, one a couple of years ago, which leaned pretty heavily left, as Last Week Tonight with John Oliver does, but the other just last month with some real concerns about the ethics of the justices, particularly Justice Clarence Thomas, and really questioning how, in a country where Congress does almost nothing for the good of the American people, really only does what the current president's party, or the party in power, the party out of power, does. It really only does the bidding of the party in power, the party out of power. Can we trust Congress to actually remove justices when they are, guilty of misbehavior? And I think with what they show of Clarence Thomas is, the answer is really no. We're never going to remove a justice for bad behavior, unless they go out and actually murder someone on camera. So the best option here is probably to consider set long terms for Supreme Court justices. Not 2 years or 6 years like the House and Senate, not 4 years like the president, but 10, 15-year terms for justices, so that they can really understand their role, but that they are up for reappointment by a future president and a reconfirmation by the Senate. If nothing else, because maybe they're too old and they're not thinking that well. That happens, and they want their power rather than recusing themselves. And the justices don't have to think about, when am I going to retire under a president that leans towards me or away from me. So we should really consider term limits for the Supreme Court. The other idea to consider really is changing the number of justices on the Supreme Court. A lot of people have heard the liberal argument of packing the court with more justices, having 11, having 20 justices. I think actually that adds complexity. And I think that the better option, and a lot of people have called me crazy for saying this, is to have an even number of justices. 4 justices and 4 justices. Have an even number of justices. And what you would set up, you'd have to write this into the Constitution, is that if there is a tie, if the Supreme Court, if the highest court in the land cannot interpret the law that we the people in Congress wrote, the Supreme Court cannot interpret a law and it's split 4-4, and we write into the Constitution, that law gets kicked back to Congress. That law is not a valid law anymore. It's not a valid act or whatever it may be that the Supreme Court is interpreting. So within 6 months then, Congress has to rewrite that law. So by definition, if you had equal numbers of justices, 3 and 3, 4 and 4, 5 and 5, whatever it is, then the Supreme Court cannot come to these really contentious issues with a political Supreme Court. Now, this would set up problems. You have to set up how many months does Congress have to rewrite the law? What happens if Congress doesn't clarify the law? And this ties into a campaign where independents running for president, trying to get both of these parties and really everybody in the country to come together and debate these topics in Congress. But most of us would agree, either we write term limits for Supreme Court justices into the Constitution, or we take some other actions to make the Supreme Court less political. Most of us agree in the country, the Supreme Court has become too political. We don't really have faith in Congress. We haven't for most of my life, and Congress is us. We make the laws. We don't really have a lot of faith in the presidency, right? Most people alternate between, I've, like the president's party. No, the president's not my party. Most of us are kind of like, I voted for the lesser of two evils. So we've lost faith in Congress ourselves. We've lost faith in the presidency. And in the last 5-10 years, increasingly, we're losing faith in the Supreme Court. We are losing faith in our federal government, which is pretty much all that we have that binds us. We need to come back to the drawing board in Congress and revolutionize the Constitution. We need to all come together for another American Revolution. So the Supreme Court is an excellent way to think about that. Most of us agree on term limits for justices. Let's use that as a stepping stone to come back and revitalize the American Constitution, revitalize America with second revolution. My name is John Fial. Go ahead and donate, pitch in today, and share with everyone you know Fial Forward. Fial Forward, baby. Thank you.